history of Project Piaba, we started the project really in the late 80s when Dr. Labish Chow became a professor of ichthyology at the University of Amazonas. And he wanted to make use of the aquatic resources of the region as a basis primarily for teaching scientific methodology. He started bringing students out into the field to study fish and fisheries and kind of follow the stories that they encountered. And one of the biggest stories in the region was the ornamental fishery that occurs here. And the people that live here, the fishing communities that are living over a very broad range of the Amazon, all benefiting from this resource, understand that their fisheries depend on pristine resources. And they serve as a very effective first line of defense for the forest. And they really will not allow any destructive practices to happen. They know the area very well. They'll know where they can expect to find cardinal tetras. And they'll paddle out. They'll even just look at the trees and shrubs and the physical shape of the environment to know that there's a high likelihood of where there'll be fish. They have a technique where they can actually splash the water a little bit, and they call it calling the fish. They'll lean over and just do this technique that really amazed me, where they can literally call the fish to them to find out if there are enough fish there. They'll put their net in the water, their hapeshe, a long bowed type net, and they don't wield the net necessarily to scoop the fish. They'll herd the fish often into their net. And so once they get the fish in the net, they will transfer them to a holding container on their canoe. Typically it's a woven basket lined with a plastic bag. At their fishing camps or their communities, they'll have net pens about maybe 1 meter by 2 meters made out of mosquito mesh, and they'll stitch it into a sort of a cube, and they'll stake sticks into the substrate of the river to hold its shape, and they'll transfer their fish into the pen. And they may be there for as much as a week. They often feed the fish, and the fish are often fed just table scraps or whatever they have around. And so when someone is heading into Barcelos, some of the families have a slightly larger diesel boat that can do a longer journey of 24 hours or so to get into Barcelos. They'll transfer the fish from the net pens to plastic tubs, or casapas, they're called here. And they'll put all the casapas on their diesel boat, and they'll make their way into Barcelos. In Barcelos, there are some floating transfer stations where they'll offload their tubs, and there their catch will be counted, and they'll get paid for their fish. The city of Barcelos has a huge celebration based on the ornamental fishery. They call it Festa de Peixe Ornamental de Barcelos, the Ornamental Fish Festival of Barcelos. And it's the culmination, the manifestation of the cultural importance of the fishery to the region. It's another example of the powerful role that this ornamental fishery plays, socioeconomically, with livelihoods, environmentally, with protectionism. But really, this is one of the really funnest facets where the people just explode in celebration of ornamental fish. And so every year, Barcelos has this festival, and it's not enough to just celebrate ornamental fish. They compete in their celebration of ornamental fish. They have built a special stadium just for this celebration, and it's called the Piabodrome. The Piaba Dome is where they have this festival. And they pick two sides, and it's competitive. One side represents the cardinal tetra, obviously an important fish, and also the other side represents the discus side, another hugely important fish to the aquarium fish trade. And they fly in special judges to Barcelos to observe the festival and to score them on different criteria on choreography, music, costumes, floats, everything. So over the course of actually a few hours, the different waves of dancers and performers come into the stadium, and if you follow it, they often have a long story. They'll tell some of the history of Barcelos leading up to the ornamental fishery, and they'll symbolically represent a lot of fishers. They'll have them in fancy costumes and dancing, but it's clearly representing the ornamental fishers. And there are very few tourists that come to Barcelos. In fact, the groups that come up with Project Piaba every year are often the only foreigners that come. So this is something that's very organic to this community. It's not a show that's put on to draw outsiders in. It's just a pure celebration that the community's having. And it's really a beautiful thing. And when you watch this celebration, you just see this purity and the beauty and the innocence of this community. But often when I watch it, I feel a little bit worried, and I feel a very heavy sense of responsibility, because this is just such a beautiful celebration and explosion of happiness. I'm burdened with the thought of the likelihood of fishery collapse. And I enjoy the moment of seeing this great celebration, but I have serious concerns, and I think about coming back in 5 or 10 years if the fishery collapses, just to see the Piabodrome in ruins, because this festival and this celebration will stop and this cultural aspect will be lost. So it's quite a powerful experience to take this celebration in. And as I said, it is a burden, and it's actually a motivator when you just see something so beautiful and you know that you can have a role in preserving it.
Several weeks ago, these fish would have been in the wild somewhere in the Rio Negro. They would have been transported down to Barcelos, to one of the transfer stations that we saw, the one that was a ship, or the floating transfer station. From there, they would have been transported down river to Manaus, held, in this case, I believe Suid was the exporter. So he would have acquired them. They would have been in his ponds, would have shipped them out to Florida. Segrist would have picked them up. They've had them for the last week, 8 days or so, and then they've shipped them here to the northwest today. So they've had a long trip over the last couple of weeks. You can see. So there we go. There's a bag of large wild cardinals from Brazil. They're actually really good sized, and we'll get them in. So we'll hold them back here for a couple of weeks. We'll observe them, feed them, get them ready, get them feeding, and then we'll move them out onto the sales floor for about 2 weeks.